Thank you. Good evening to you. Glad you're here. Happy Tuesday. Well, happy almost Tuesday night. Hope you're having a great week. Glad you're here tonight. Have a good time together in the book of Numbers. Talk about all the fun stuff that's in there. All right, so a couple announcements as we begin. First of all, some of you have already received, if you've been checking your phone, you probably already received a text about the possibility to vote. As I mentioned Sunday, we have a couple of votes. The official meeting will be this week, Sunday. We're already beginning absentee ballots. Those are two issues on the ballots. One, voting to spend up to $31,000 for the driveway over here off of Telegraph. All right, so up to $31,000 for that. That's been in disrepair for a while. We keep patching it and trying to kind of work it through, but I think the plan now is to get that done before winter. And so up to 31, hopefully less than 25, 24,750, hopefully. But if we have to do one part, it'll be about 31,000. So that's vote number one. Vote number two is a vote to spend $6,000 as a gift to the Cuthbertsons for their ministry in Africa, particularly to buy a vehicle suitable for traveling from village to village, wherever they're going to plant churches. When he was here, he mentioned how they're doing that, and they were trying to raise money for it. And the missions committee and the deacons think it'd just be a good thing to do the whole thing. And so we are voting to spend $6,000. They can get what they need for that. And so those two items are on the ballot. You can vote one of three ways. Number one, you can show up Sunday and vote on Sunday here at the church building. That'll be a paper ballot. Number two, you can pick up a paper ballot tonight and vote absentee. Those should be out in the back. Get a ballot and an envelope and fill it out. Put your name on it, and you can vote that way. The third way you can vote is electronically. So if you're not here tonight, or if you just want to do it electronically, you should have received a text. You'll probably receive an email as well at some point. When you go online, click on that text. It will take you to a place where you'll enter your name, and you will check that you are a member. And once you check that you are a member, it will open up two voting options, and you can vote yes or no. It'll be self-explanatory, but if you open that up, you're like, where am I voting? It won't show you anything until you click, yes, I am a member. All right? Again, when we tally those votes, we will separate the names from the votes. And just in the interest of full disclosure, we do have the ability to see it all. We will not use that ability. Just the way it reports, we'll separate them. And so the names and the votes will be separated. And so if you're worried about somebody finding out how you voted, we know. But we won't look it up. All right, so just keep that in mind. Please participate in that vote. If you have any questions about that, see myself. Pastor Stephen is here tonight. Pastor Jerry, I think, is here somewhere. See one of the deacons who may ask you to come see us anyway. Whatever the case is, see somebody tonight and ask the questions. Make sure we get all those answered, all right? Announcement number two, Sunday evening, we're having another family fun night. Hope you'll plan on being here Sunday about 6 o'clock. We'll be outdoors, Lord willing. Hopefully it won't rain. I'm tempted to say we're going to be outdoors even if it does rain, but we'll make that call. I don't know. I haven't even looked at the forecast yet. Not that it would be helpful. But in any event, Sunday evening, 6 o'clock, it's a dessert fellowship. And so a dessert potluck. So bring a dessert. We'll put it on the table. We'll have some drinks, water and lemonade and stuff for you to drink. Bring a dessert, and we'll have all the paper, the plates, the napkins, all the plasticware, all that stuff. So plan on being here. Have a good time on Sunday night, all right? Tryouts for Upward Football, those have begun. So if you have a child interested, or if you know somebody, maybe in your neighborhood, it'd be a great way to introduce somebody to the church. Steve Massengill and his team do an excellent job with Upward Football. Last year we had a big influx because a whole bunch of sport leagues were shut down. And I had so many good comments about the way it was run, and I was glad to point to Steve and his team, the coaches who do just a fabulous job. So if you have some kids in your neighborhood, maybe you're too old for upward football. If you're, I think, over 12, you're too old for it. But if you know a kid in your neighborhood might be interested, it's a great way to be involved in the sport. It's a great way to have a good time. And so let them know about that. Tryouts are August 5th, which is a Thursday, I believe from 5 until 7. And then August the 7th, which is a Saturday morning from 9 until 11. All right, so keep that in mind. You can go on the Church Center app on the calendar, and you can register there. If you have questions, contact the church office. That's enough. Let's pray and get into the good stuff, right? Father, give us a good time together tonight in your word. Encourage us with it. We have a great opportunity to learn from you, and so teach us. Give us understanding. In the name of Jesus, I pray. Amen. All right, Numbers 25. We are in the introduction to the Pentateuch, and we are headed towards finishing this out by the end of the summer. Got a few weeks left. So remember where we've been. The Pentateuch is what? The first 5 books of the Old Testament, which also happens to be the first 5 books of the whole Bible, right? It is the section, if you, the Hebrew name for the Pentateuch is what? Anybody know? The Torah, the law, or the instruction, right? So the Hebrew name is the Torah, and in fact, that is the first part of the Hebrew name of the Old Testament, the Tanakh, the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim. That's the Hebrew name for the Old Testament. The Torah is the first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. It really counts from the beginning of time, whenever that was. And personally, I think it's probably 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. Some people might differ on that a little bit. But from the beginning of time, from the creation in the beginning, God created all the way until about 1400 BC when Israel gets ready to cross over the Jordan River into the Promised Land. All right, so maybe 5,000 years of history, maybe 4,000, somewhere in that neighborhood. All right, we don't know for sure, but from the beginning of time all the way up until the crossing into the Promised Land. A couple of high points. First of all, the creation, obviously, right? God created, that was there. The fall. That's I call it a high point. It's not really a high point, probably the low point, but you know what I mean. Points of particular highlighting in the book of Genesis. Genesis 12 is the call of Abraham, where God separates out for himself a people, the descendants of Abraham, separate in terms of God's promise and God's covenant, separate from all the other nations of the earth. All right, so at that point in Genesis 12, God picks out a particular ethnic identity of people that he's going to call his chosen people. All right, in Exodus 19 and 20, after the Exodus, they become more than just an ethnic identity. They turn into a political identity, sort of a kingdom of priests, God calls them in Exodus 19. You will be to me a kingdom of priests. I will be your God. Okay, so you have the genetic or the ethnic identity of Israel as God's people, the descendants of Abraham, distinct from all the other nations. Then in Exodus 19 with the Sinai covenant, the Mosaic covenant, they became a political entity, a nation, more than just an ethnic group, an actual nation, a political entity, a state, all right? So the Mosaic law then becomes kind of the law of the land. And remember that Mosaic law, with all of its probably 613 commandments, deals both man with God and man with each other, all right? It regulated life in the community of Israel. Remember, as I said, anytime you get more than 2 people together, you have to have a means by which you're going to settle problems and disagreements. The more people you get, the more you have to have something like a law, a universal standard of some sort. That Mosaic law was passed down as an expression of the will of God for particular people living at that time. Okay? It's the expression of God's character for people at that time. All right, now we'll deal more with that as we close out this series in a few weeks. All right? That's Mosaic law. The Exodus. They come out of Egypt. Leviticus is all those laws, all right, the laws of the priesthood, the Levites. You get into the book of Numbers, which is known for the census, the counting, the numbers of the people, right? And in the book of Numbers, then you have the story you're familiar with, the 12 tribes who go into the land as spies to see what to do. They come back and say, there's no way we can win. God says, fine, you won't win. Your children will win, but not you. You're going to die in the wilderness. As we looked in the early part of the book of Numbers, we've seen a number of instances of whining and complaining, both directed at Moses and God. Why did you bring us out of Egypt? At least there we had food, we had water, we had all these good things. Again, the years of the Exodus had kind of affected their memory. Things weren't as good, but at the time it looked better. It was an act of distrust in God. God punishes them for that. All right, last week when we closed out, we talked about Balaam and Balak, the talking donkey. Got to get the in the right place, the talking donkey. And Balaam, who is unable to curse God's people. Balaam, who is unable to curse God's people. Remember, Balak, the king of Moab, he said, I'm scared of all these Israelites. Balaam, you're a divine person. You have a connection with the gods. Come and curse them for me. Bring divine judgment on these Israelites. And at first, Balaam says no. They come back with bags of money. Balaam says no, but let me pray about it. He ends up going. The donkey talks to him on the way. And, he's beating the donkey, right? And the donkey says, why are you beating me? I'm not the one who did this. All right, so long story short, Balaam is hired to curse, but he is unable to curse. Every time he opens his mouth, blessings fall out. Now, the New Testament likens that. Remember, Balaam, who loved the wages of unrighteousness. He blessed God's people. Now, here's what's interesting is sometimes you read the Bible and you see stories that are right next to each other, right? And you're like, why did they go from there to there? That's one of those situations. So Numbers 22-24 is a story of Balaam. And you have this guy who every time he opens his mouth, he blesses God's people. Now you come to Numbers 25, so turn there and follow along. Israel remained at Shittim, and typically in the Hebrew, that I am ending is a plural, all right, and typically that's where the emphasis would be, so it's probably, you would say it's something along the lines of Shittim, all right? It's a city, probably on the eastern bank of the Jordan River. This is where in Joshua chapter 2, when Joshua sends another set of spies in to spy the land, he sends them from Shittim. So it's somewhere close there to the Jordan River. So they moved up kind of the east side. They are camping there, and the people begin to play the harlot with the daughters of Moab. Now, this idea of playing the harlot, it's a familiar Old Testament image of spiritual adultery. All right, the leaving of God to whom they had pledged their covenant loyalty. When God says, I will be your God, you will be my people, the people in Exodus 19 said, yes, that's the way it will be. We will be your people and you'll be our God. That relationship in the Old Testament is likened to a marriage. And to go after other gods then is to commit fornication. Adultery. They play the harlot with the daughters of Moab, for they invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to idols. So Israel joined themselves to Baal of Peor. You're familiar with the name Baal, right? Baal is a name of the god. Ashtoreth is probably the goddess, and so you have multiple gods, but Baal is probably one of the well-known names, one of the well-known gods. Baal of Peor was the Baal of a particular region. And so you might have a Baal of this region, a Baal of that region. Remember, in those days and ages, you didn't have the instant kind of communication we have today. You didn't even have something like telegraph or telephone. You wanted to communicate. It was often months by traveling one way or another. So you would have regions that would have particular ideas of God. Baal and Ashtoreth are often considered to be fertility gods. Gods of fertility. And so Baal of Peor, again, is the god of a particular region. Now what happens is they invite the people to the sacrifices of their gods. People ate and bowed down their gods. There becomes a spiritual act of adultery that they have left Yahweh and turned aside to this false god. So the Lord says to Moses, take all the leaders of the people and execute them in broad daylight before the Lord, so that the fierce anger of the Lord may turn away from Israel. And that ought to strike a little fear in your heart, shouldn't it? Take all the leaders, the people who should have known better, and execute them. So Moses said to the judges of Israel, each of you slay his men who have joined themselves to Baal of Peor. Remember, the judges of Israel quite possibly are those 70 elders. Remember, at some point you have the 70 elders that are responsible for administrative and judicial help. That's back in Exodus. In Numbers, you have 70 elders that are responsible for spiritual leadership. It may be that they're the same group. It may be that there's two sets of 70 elders. I think this is probably that group. I think. I'm not going to die on that hill, but I tend to think because remember, Moses had set up this hierarchy. This is too much for me. So he had these people. So he sends them, you go execute these people in broad daylight. In other words, this is going to be a public issue. All of the people need to know what the cost of this spiritual adultery is. Now, does capital punishment seem a little bit harsh for religious, we're just worshiping another God, right? This is not the same thing as changing a church, right? This is not like, hey, we're not really good in this church and we're going to go down there to another church that still preaches the gospel. Now, listen, I don't want you to do that, okay? So if you're thinking about leaving the church, come and talk to me about it, all right? Or at least come and talk to me about it. I promise I'll be nice to you, all right? This is not what this is. This is leaving the one true and living God to go and worship a false God who is not really a God at all. He might be a supernatural being, one of those rulers and authorities and principalities and powers that's talked about in the New Testament. He might be an actual supernatural being, demonic of some sort, but he's not a God. Right? So you have left your loyal covenant to the one true and living God and gone and given that love and that honor and that worship to somebody else. Again, capital punishment might seem a bit strong for us. One thing you have to understand is the whole dynamic of what it meant to be a part of the covenant community of Israel. That this was not, today in our modern American context, we talk about freedom of religion, separation of church and state. There's no such thing in ancient Israel. It was a theocracy. We don't live in a theocracy today, okay? There was no such thing as separation of church and state. Religion and state were intertwined together, and that was by God's design. Today, we live in an entirely different world, and that's one of the reasons why I emphasized a few minutes ago, the laws of Israel were expressions of God's will for those people living at that time. They are not necessarily expressions of God's will for us today. We'll get in a lot of trouble if we go down that road. And I think there are good biblical reasons, and one of the things we'll do at the end of this, we'll have a whole session on the use of the Old Testament law, particularly for believers today. What do we do with all these laws? Okay, we'll talk about that and how to understand it. But here's what I want us to emphasize. Capital punishment for turning away from God, what do you think eternity in hell is about? It's the punishment for those who turned away from the one true and living God. So there's a sense in which, I mentioned Sunday this idea, we got a great king, right? Worship the king, honor the king, Jesus. He is a great and loving king. But the church is the people who are already bowing down to that king. One day, every knee will bow and every tongue will confess. Right now, the church is already doing that. What you have here is people who are getting started early on eternity in hell, separated from God for their sins of rebellion. That's what this is. Harsh. When you get to be God, you can decide that. But until then, I think we go with what God says. Now, here's one of the hard parts. We'll talk about this at the end tonight, Lord willing. Wow. I'm just looking at the clock. I don't know when the end will be, but we'll talk about it. This idea of, and you've heard it before, the Canaanite genocide. What about God going and telling Israel, go and kill all those people? Right? It's a tough issue. Now, here's one thing I think that we need to be wary of, and I've said this often. Let me just say this again. Sometimes we try to defend God in matters in which God never seems to defend himself. We try to come up with all these reasons, and God never seemed to feel it necessary to do that. I think there comes a time, listen, I believe we should search for explanations. I believe we should search for meanings. But I think we need to be really careful of attempting to bail God out of difficult situations. God's God. He gets to do what he wants. and as the king of the universe, the one who sits in the heavens. I mentioned that Sunday, right? Psalm 2, the one who sits in the heavens. Why does he sit in the heavens? Because that is the scope of his reign. Balak, he's the king of Moab. I mean, Moab's bigger than Taylor, right? So being the king of Moab is something, but it's not the king of the heavens, right? His reign is unlimited. God's reign is unlimited. And so all nations owe him loyalty, particularly his own people. One of the sons of Israel came and brought to his relatives a Midianite woman. Now, where did the Midianites come from? Because we're talking about the Moabites, and all of a sudden, here comes a Midianite woman. What's the connection? And there's a couple possibilities, okay? It's not entirely clear. Some people believe that the Midianites is kind of a generic name for a whole bunch of people in the region. So the Moabites, the Ammonites, all these, none of these people would be considered Midianites. Some people believe that Midianites is a particular a group, a nation state like Moab. So you have the Moabites and the Midianites as two separate. Again, I'm not going to die on that hill. I don't really know. At the very least, we know that the Midianites and the Moabites are closely connected together here. So don't get confused about what's going on. This is all one event. This Israelite brings a Midianite woman, comes to his relatives in the sight of Moses, in the sight of the congregation, the sons of Israel, while they're weeping at the doorway of the tent of meeting. Why were they weeping? Because the judges had just gone through executing those who had participated in false worship. And while this weeping is going on, this guy brings a Midianite woman. We find out later in the chapter, she is the daughter of one of the leaders of Midian. She'd be like a princess. Now, one of the things you know in ancient times, and probably not so much today, but in ancient times, one of the common things was political alliances were made through marriages. All right, so the son of a king would marry the daughter of another king in order to form kind of a political alliance. Or maybe the king himself. That's how Solomon got started, right? Why did Solomon have all those wives and concubines? A lot of them were probably political relations, political marriages. So here's what you have. This guy, like, all the people around us are dying because we have started down this road of idolatry that probably included sexual immorality. Okay? Playing the harlot is probably not entirely a religious metaphor. Given the nature of ancient idol worship and cultic prostitution, it's probably more than a metaphor. So there are thousands of people dying. In fact, verse number 9 tells us there were 24,000. The blood of 24,000 people is running in the streets, and you bring a Midianite woman home in front of them. It's almost like a slap in the face. Do you not understand this is the reason 24,000 people have just died? And you don't even have the common decency to hide it? You're going to bring it in front of your family, in front of Moses, in front of all the congregation of Israel? Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, so this is Aaron's grandson, he sees this. He grabs a spear in the midst of, so this whole crowd of people, Phinehas sees this. I don't know if he looked around for a second. Is anybody going to do anything here? And he grabs a spear and he heads into the tent where this couple has just made their way. And he pierces both of them through, the man of Israel and the woman through the body. So it's an image of stabbing them both at one time. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out what was going on, does it? Now, here's what I want us to understand from this. This was not just, a couple hooking up on the side, as bad as that would have been. This is an act of spiritual idolatry and the relationships that go along with it, possibly even cultic prostitution. And Phinehas says, not while I'm here. He grabs a spear, runs them both through at one time, and the plague on the sons of Israel was checked. This is what stops it. 24,000 people died. Now, again, we could all sit here and wonder out loud or wonder silently about the sovereignty of God and justice and all those things. Here's what we know, is that they had professed this covenant loyalty to God and God alone. They got involved in idolatry, probably sexual debauchery and idol worship. public, unrepentant, unhidden, there's a price to pay for that. Now, I don't know if this Midianite woman and this Israeli Jewish man, I don't know if they were part of the 24,000 or if this is like 24,002. I don't know for sure. But there was a high price to pay for it because God is not going to tolerate idolatry. And he's not going to tolerate it from us. Now, the chances of 24,000 of us dying, probably slim. The chances of idolatry rising up in our midst with eternal consequences is probably higher than that. Okay, God is working a different way now in terms of how he executes justice. For a time, God is satisfied right now. God did not stamp out all of the idol worshipers immediately. And idol worship continues to be a problem all the way through the life of Israel, all the way up until 586 BC, when Nebuchadnezzar effectively ends the monarchy. And the reason that happens is because they kept going back to idols. Now, Phinehas, what happens to Phinehas? Phinehas gets honored, verses 10 and following there. Because he has stood up, he was jealous with my jealousy among them, so I did not destroy the sons of Israel in my jealousy. I will give them a covenant of peace. And what happens is the line of Phinehas then becomes a line through which the priesthood runs. Now, he's the grandson of Aaron, but Aaron had a number of different grandsons. Because of Phinehas' actions, he is particularly honored by God that his sons and grandsons will be part of the priesthood perpetually. As long as there's a priesthood, it'll go through them. All right? So what you have here is just an interesting story. Now, remember earlier I said there are two stories side by side. And they often cause us to think. One of the ones I think of is Genesis 38 and 39. The story of Judah and the story of Joseph. And Judah goes out and connects with a prostitute and has a son. And you read 37 is the story of how Joseph gets sent to Egypt. And 39 is the story of Joseph in Potiphar's house. And 38 doesn't mention Joseph at all. Why? Why do you have Judah right in the middle of 37, 38? You know, if I'm arranging that, I'd put the story of Judah somewhere else so the story of Joseph all stays together. But in Genesis 38, what you have is that interesting juxtaposition that Judah and Joseph, two men faced with the same temptation and two men faced with the same temptation address it two entirely different ways. And it highlights the character of Joseph. Judah had no self-control. Joseph did. And it highlights the character. Now, why do I say it here? Remember, Numbers 22 to 24 has talked about Balaam. And he was unable to curse God's people. Now, here's what you may not know. Numbers 31:16 talks about the Midianites and the judgment on the Midianites. The Midianites, caused the sons of Israel through the counsel of Balaam to trespass against the Lord in the matter of Peor, so the plague was among the congregation of the Lord. Revelation 2:14, I have a few things against you because there are some of there who, and this is the letter to one of the churches, there are some of you there who hold the teaching of Balaam, who kept teaching Balak to put a stumbling block before the sons of Israel to eat things sacrificed to idols and commit acts of immorality. Now follow what's going on here. Balaam opens his mouth, and every time he does, blessings pour out. He cannot curse God's people. But he can tell Balak how to seduce God's people. He can't curse them. But he can teach Balak how to seduce them. And you can maybe imagine this conversation because Balak was desperate. Listen, I keep paying you money, and every time you open your mouth, all you do is say good things about him. Yeah, I don't have any choice about that, but here, let me tell you how to get them. Get them through idol worship. You can seduce them that way. Balaam, in a sense, is responsible for this. And there's a sense in which even though God's people could not be cursed, they could be seduced. And Balaam was at the heart of both of it. He could not curse them, but he did tell them how to seduce them. That's Numbers 25. Numbers 26 is the second census. Remember, Numbers 1 was a census. Numbers 26 is a census. There's one big change, and that is in the tribe of Simeon. They go from 59,300 people in chapter 1 to 22,200 people in 26. Why that big change? Downward. It may be that the tribe of Simeon had a particular role in that Senate Peor. We don't know for sure, but it may be. That's probably the biggest gap there. The strangest one. You expect the little changes here and there. The biggest one is that number that changes, and it may be the connection with Peor there. 27, and let me just highlight some chapters here for us. We're not going to deal in depth with. Chapter 27 is the inheritance of families without sons. Now again, in Israel, inheritance was passed down from father to son. What happens if you don't have a son? Well, chapter 27 addresses that. Right? It also appoints Joshua as a successor to Moses. That's in 27. 28 and 29 are laws about offerings. We talked a few weeks ago about all the various offerings, the burnt offering, the sin offering, the fellowship offering, all those. Remember those various kinds of offerings we talked about? And then we talked about the feasts, the feast of the tabernacles, the Passover, all these different kind of feasts. Numbers 28 and 29 basically repeats all that. Okay, just instructions about the offerings. Chapter 30 is laws concerning vows. Okay, what happens when you make a vow? If you make a vow, pay it, but there are certain qualifications around those vows. That's Numbers 30. Numbers 31, I quoted from this just a moment ago. Numbers 31, if you flip over there for a moment, then the Lord spoke to Moses, take full vengeance for the sons of Israel on the Midianites. Vengeance for what? For the sin at Peor. Now, here's what's interesting about this. Who is responsible for Israel's sin at Peor? Israel is responsible, right? They were seduced, both spiritually and apparently physically. They were seduced into this false idolatry and false worship. Guess who else is responsible for the sin of Peor? The Midianites. Take vengeance on them. Today, in our society, it's common to play the blame game. Whose fault is it? And there's a tendency to want to place all the fault on one side or all the fault on the other. Quite frankly, in a world of sinful people, it is most frequent that there's plenty of blame to go around. Plenty of blame to go around. Israel was wicked for their idolatry. It cost them 24,000 of their fellow Israelites. Midianites were also responsible for it. So God says, take vengeance on them. Arm them for war. So they go against Midian and execute the Lord's justice on Midian, the Lord's vengeance. So they go through, they make war, verse number 7, just the Lord commanded. They killed every male. They killed the kings, along with the rest of their slain, Evi and Rechem and Zur and Hur and Reba and the 5 kings of Midian. They killed Balaam, the son of Beor. Hey, there's that name again. They captured the women and the little ones, the cattle, their flocks, and all their goods they plundered. They burned their cities where they lived and all their camps with fire. They took the spoil and all the prey, both of man and beast. They brought the captives and the prey and the spoil to Moses, Eleazar the priest, and the congregation of the sons of Israel to the camp of the plains of Moab, which are by the Jordan opposite Jericho. Now, don't read ahead just a second, okay? What would you imagine? You're one of these soldiers, you've gone out. Moses says, go kill them all. You've gone out, you've killed all the men, you've captured all the women, you killed the animals, you took all the plunder, you took everything. Total, what seems to be a total victory. What would you expect coming back to Moses? When you think about kind of a rah-rah session, great job, guys, you did it. Let's all worship and praise and celebrate together. That's not Moses' response. Moses and Eleazar the priest and the leaders of the congregation went out to meet with him outside the camp, and Moses was angry with the officers of the army, captains of thousands, captains of hundreds who had come from service in the war. Moses said, have you spared all the women? Behold, these caused the sons of Israel through the counsel of Balaam to trespass against the Lord in the matter of Peor. So the plague was among the congregation of the Lord. Why'd you spare the women? The women caused the problem. Again, is there a little bit there like, whoa, you can't say that? I'm just reading it, okay? I didn't write it. I'm just reading it. And you can read it there and make sure I read it right. All right? There's a part of us that said, well, wait, just back up. Have you spared all the women? Behold, these cause the sons of Israel. Now, therefore, kill every male among the little ones. Kill every woman who has known man intimately. But all the girls who have not known man intimately, spare for yourselves. Again, who's responsible? We want to live in this day and age where we want to put all the blame on this side or that side. And there comes a point where we've got to say, you know what? There's plenty of blame to go around. And we do not do justice when we refuse to blame people who are blameworthy. It's not just. Now, harsh, kill them all. I want to come back to that in a couple of minutes. Okay? Chapter 32 is the story of Reuben and Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh. Remember when they cross over the Jordan from the east over to the west, there are 2.5 tribes that want to stay on the east side of the Jordan. This is great land. Let us live here. Let us raise our families here in Gilead. And there's a concern. What do you mean? How can you guys stay here? We got to go take the promised land, and you guys want to stay here and get out of that. They said, no, we'll go and fight with you. Just let us build our cities. Let us put our families here. We'll go fight. We'll help you in the conquest, and then we'll come back. And they agreed. Okay, as long as you'll come help us fight, you guys can live over here. One of the interesting things that happens in this whole issues with half-tribe Manasseh, and we'll see this later on, they actually build a replica of the tabernacle there in the altar. And people are really concerned about this. How can you build this altar? You're supposed to worship at this one. This is the only right altar. Now, remember in those days, this is equivalent to the words of Jesus and the Samaritan woman. You guys say in this mountain, in this place we should worship. You say you should worship over here. Where is it? And what's Jesus' response? There's a day coming when it's not going to matter. That day had not come yet. At this time in Israel, you have to worship at the central altar. And one of the big problems later on in history is when Jeroboam builds an altar in the wrong place. And now there's 2 altars. And remember the reason he did it. When the north and the south split. The reason he did it is because if all these northerners go back down south and start to worship at the real altar, they're not coming back. I'm going to lose my kingdom. I got to build. This was an entirely different reason. They built an altar there because they said, we don't want our children to forget. This is not an instrument of worship for us. This is an instrument of remembrance for us. And like, oh, well, that makes sense. All right. They divide the land there. Chapter 33 is just a review of the journey. If you want to test your sight reading skills, try to read that one out loud. Okay, it's just a list of names. They camped at this place, then went to that place. Then they camped here and went there and there and there. It's just a list of names, mostly through it. Chapter 33, verse 50 then begins this instructions about how to take the land, how to apportion the land once they get in there. And here's what I want to focus on here for the last couple of minutes is verse number 51. Speak to the sons of Israel, say to them, when you cross over the Jordan into the land of Canaan, drive out all the inhabitants of the land from before you, destroy all their figured stones, destroy the molten images, demolish their high places, take possession of land and live in it, for I've given you the land to possess it. You shall inherit it by lot according to your families. To the larger you give more inheritance, to the smaller you give less. Whatever lot falls to anyone that shall be his, you shall inherit according to the tribes of your fathers. Again, this is how you divide the land up, right? But when you go in, take possession, drive out all the inhabitants. Now notice the warning here. If you do not drive out the inhabitants of the land from before you, then it shall come about that those whom you let remain will become pricks in your eyes and thorns in your sides, and they will trouble you in the land in which you live. And as I plan to do to them, so I will do to you. Now this sets the stage for a whole lot of stuff, and let me just hit it here briefly. All right? When you go in the land, make sure you drive everybody out. This is not a land sharing. This is not a 2-state solution. We hear all kinds of stuff today about a 2-state solution. Now, let me just tell you right now, the book of Numbers, Deuteronomy, nothing in the Bible has anything to do with a modern 2-state solution. All right? It just doesn't. The Bible is not addressing modern-day Israel. Right now, Israel's living in rejection. There's a sense in which they are on their own. Now, Israelis and Palestinians are both people made in the image of God. We should fight and work for all of them to be treated with dignity and respect and honor because they're people made in the image of God. All right? This has nothing to do with that. At this point, God says, I've given this land, drive everybody out of it. Take their lands. Now, what God does say is, I'm going to drive them, I'll drive them out before you, he'll say later on. And he said, I'm not going to drive them out all at once, because if I drive them out all at once, guess what? Their lands, their gardens and their crops and all that, they're going to get all kinds of weeds in. It's going to be real hard. So essentially what God says, I'm going to leave them there long enough to tend the land and keep the gardens good for you until you get there, and then we'll drive them out. But the reason you are to drive them out is because if you leave them behind, you're going to start worshiping their gods. You're going to start marrying their daughters and their sons. And what's going to happen is you're going to have what we call today syncretism, the mixing of two religions. You're going to have your Jewish kinds of things, and we're going to have our, they're going to have their Palestinian Baal worship things. You're going to try to blend them together in some kind of syncretism, and they will corrupt you. And if you do that, I'm going to do to you what I said I would do to them, which is drive them out of the land. Now, as you read the Israel's history throughout the rest of the Old Testament, guess what they do not do? They do not drive out all of God's people. Oh, I'm sorry, they do not drive out all of the inhabitants of the land. They leave someone behind. And guess what happens? They start worshiping their gods. They start intermarrying with them. And about 1,000 years later, about 900 years later, guess what happens? God does to Israel what he said he would do to the Canaanites in the land, which is what? Drive them out. God says, you are to drive them out. And if you don't do it, I will do the same thing to you. By 722, what happens to the northern kingdom? God drives them out. By 586, what happens to the southern kingdom? God drives them out. Why? Because he said, if you do not drive them out, I will do to you what I will do to them. Now, again, remember this. God's always playing the long game. God doesn't play short games. God's in it for the long haul. Never forget that, right? Which brings us to this last question. What about holy war? What is a holy war? We read a lot about this today. There's a lot of historical connections to it. There's a lot of talk going on. One of the biggest complaints people have about the Bible, and there's a long list of complaints people have about the Bible, let's be honest, right? But one of the biggest ones about the Old Testament is what is commonly known as the Canaanite genocide, which is connected to this very idea right here, the Midianites. What, you only killed all their men? You should have killed all the women too, right? Good God, why can you do that? And I don't mean that in some kind of profane way. I mean, you're supposed to be a good God. How in the world can you command this total extermination? You're driving all these people out of the land. God, how can you do that? What is this thing called holy war? There's a Hebrew word for it, harim, and you don't need to remember that. I just wanted to say Hebrew tonight, and so there it is. What is the holy war? There's this sense in which a holy war is a common ancient Near Eastern practice, practiced in the name of a god. Okay? It was carried on for a lot of reasons: conquest, purity, all kinds of different reasons. I believe that what you see in the Bible as holy war is not unique to Israel. What makes it different, if, and I just say this for the sake of argument, if the God of the Bible is the one true and living God, that puts it on a different plane. Right? This is not a false God. This is not a false idea. This is the truth of the one true and living God. It is a ritual act of divine judgment. I'm quoting here from Sunday. A ritual act of divine judgment enacted militarily by Israel in the Promised Land as indicative of the inviolable relationship between God, the provider, and his covenanted people, so as to restore order, render justice, remove abomination, and reestablish holiness. I know it's a bunch. Let me try it again, all right? It is an act of divine judgment that is brought about by military. It's a war, okay? It is indicative of the inviolable relationship between God and his people, all right? God said, I will be your God. You'll be my people. Nothing's going to separate that. Even when Israel goes into exile in 586, guess what? God is still their God, and they are still his people. That doesn't change. All right? What happens in this is God restores order in the land, renders justice, removes abomination, and reestablishes holiness. Okay? God is clearing out the false worship. Again, it's a church state, so to speak. The religion and the politics are inseparably mixed in Israel. That is not the case we have today. Okay? We do not live in this. And that's one of the New Testament things. Okay? But in the Old Testament, God's people, it was a theocracy. God ruled over them. And so as any other king, you drive out the enemies. Now, holy war is an act of divine judgment on sinful people. Say, how in the world can God tell Israel to go in and kill all those innocent people? And the truth is, God never told anybody to kill an innocent person. Some people today, they ask the question about hell and people. What about all those innocent people who have never heard of Jesus? What happens to them? And here's the answer to that. All of the innocent people who have never heard of Jesus go to heaven. The fact is, there are no innocent people. All have sinned and fallen short of God's glory, right? So somebody like, whoa, wait a minute. You can't say that. It's because you didn't listen to the question very well, right? What happens to all the innocent people who don't hear of Jesus? They go to heaven. The fact is, all have sinned. There are no innocent people. Now, all these Canaanites in the land, when you start reading the history of the ancient Canaanites, wickedness that frankly should make our ears curl up. Child sacrifice. Why does God command all these people to be wiped out? Because of the wickedness of their sins. Okay? This is not the arbitrary judgment of God. You know, God up in heaven, looking, kill them today. We'll get them tomorrow. That's not God. This is an act of justice. These are wicked people. They were demonstrating their sin openly. It is an act of judgment on sinful people. It is not arbitrary or useless. Okay? It's an act of judgment. I think second thing, it's an act of protection for God's people. If you do not drive them out, you too will become like them. So it's an act of judgment and an act of protection. We see many times in the history of Israel, as you read the Old Testament, you see many times where this very principle comes back to haunt them. Because they did not drive them out, all of a sudden, they brought their religion in. The most famous example may be somebody like Solomon. Remember in 1 Kings, Solomon loved the Lord with all his heart. 1 Kings 3. And then by 1 Kings 11, Solomon loved many foreign women. And Solomon begins around the city of Jerusalem to build high places and altars and temples to please his wives. Because face it, men, if you're going to be married, make your wife happy. Right? Life goes a lot better when your wife is happy. Right? Solomon got this. Now, he had to do it a whole bunch of times because he married like a bazillion women, right? Not the smartest thing Solomon ever did. But that's the end of it. And what makes it hard along the way is you start intermarrying some of these people. God said, keep the marriage with Israelites. Let them marry whoever it wants. And we'll see this later. Let them marry whoever they want, only make sure it's of Israel. Right? Because once you marry outside, you're marrying people God has condemned to be killed and driven out of the land. And guess what happens next time you go to war? You look at a guy across the line wondering, I wonder if that's my cousin over there. That's my wife's brother. That's my wife's nephew over there. Talk about hard to go to war. God said, protect yourselves by obeying me. God wanted purity. Again, I know for us in our modern 21st century mindset, it's a little bit hard to stomach, all right? Today, in this day and age, holy war is not a thing for us, okay? The weapons of our warfare are not carnal. They are not fleshly. They are spiritual. Our goal as Christians is not a theocracy, okay? Our goal is not, hey, let's take guns and knives and swords and go kill everybody who's not a Christian, right? That's not the New Testament way of. When God is doing this Old Testament, there's a very specific historical context. There's a very specific religious context in terms of the worship of Yahweh. So when you read the Old Testament, again, I urge you, don't be scared by passages like this. The fact that our modern minds can't quite grasp, and there are parts, I tell you, there are parts of this when I read it, it's like, I wish I hadn't chosen to teach on the Pentateuch. Because Ephesians would be a whole lot easier. Because in Ephesians, I don't have to talk about holy war, but it's there, right? So we can't really skip it. It's what God says. Let's try our best to understand it. And in those places where we say, God, that doesn't quite make sense to me. Imagine in your mind that you're just not as smart as God is. It's probably not hard for you to imagine, right? Just understand that God is perfectly just. God is perfectly loving. God never does anything wrong. If I can't quite grasp how those pieces fit together, it's not God's problem, it's mine. Okay? And so it's okay when people come along, and this is one of the interesting things, when they say, well, all religions are the same. Really? All religions are out there offering their children as sacrifices to their gods? I don't think so, right? Now, the reality is people just say a lot of dumb things when they come to talk about religion, things that just aren't true. And this is one of the evidences. When you read the Old Testament, the religion of Israel and the religion of the Canaanites was not the same religion. We're just all worshiping the same God. No, we weren't, right? Having said all that, let me just encourage you. There are some tough issues. Don't run from them. They're in there. Embrace them, study them, and confess our own limited knowledge. As we close tonight, I want to leave some time for prayer and encourage you to grab a couple people around you and pray. There's some prayer sheets if you got one coming in. There's some prayer sheets if you didn't get one coming in. Get one on the way out. Let me just update you on a couple things. Air conditioning, we are pursuing some options. Hopefully by Sunday, we will have at least some air conditioning in here. All right? And so bring a fan if you want. If you bring one of those funeral home fans, if you keel over and die of heat, we'll at least know what funeral home to bury you out of. Remember those? All right. It won't be a hellfire and brimstone sermon. That's right. So plan on being here, but pray for us for wisdom for that. We got a lot of stuff. The lightning strike from a few weeks ago did a lot of damage to some electronics around here. We're trying to sort through all that. And so pray for wisdom in those matters. Pray particularly for outreach, okay? Think of the community. Think of the street you live on. Think of the people you work with. And think specifically how you can pray for them by face or by name. Pray for the church as a whole, but pray specifically for people, both tonight and in the weeks to come. I pray that God sends more people. We're I think, past the pandemic. It's time to start coming back. So please be here Sunday. Pray that God would be at work in our midst, and I look forward to seeing you Sunday. Don't forget the business meeting items coming up. Don't forget the family fun night. Let's spend a little bit of time in prayer. And when you're done praying, we'll be dismissed. All right, thanks so much for being here tonight. See you.